Welcome everyone. My name is Mark Wolf and I want to welcome you to today's Campus Conversations in Standish speaker event. In spring of 2015, the University at Albany Libraries launched Campus Conversations in Standish, a program designed to showcase faculty research and expertise to connect members of the UAlbany community and exchange of ideas and perspectives. Today's speaker is Professor David Carpenter, who is a public health physician who serves as the director of Institute for Health and the Environment. He is also a professor of environmental health sciences here at UAlbany's School of Public Health. He previously served as director of the Wadsworth Center at the New York State Department of Health and as dean of the University at Albany School of Public Health. Carpenter, who received his medical degree from Harvard Medical School, has published more than 435 peer-reviewed articles and has also published 6 books and 50 reviews of book chapters to his credit. Today, Professor Carpenter's presentation is entitled, "Are There Health Hazards Coming from the Rollout of 5G?" Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that there's food and refreshments in the back, so please help yourself. And please, let's welcome Professor Carpenter to the podium. And there's no clicker.
Thank you, Mark.
There's no clicker, so you can just hit the space bar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the arrows. Yeah.
Well, I guess the title I put is a little different than the one I gave Mark a long time ago, but I can answer half of the title right now. The first part I'll talk about, but what do we know about health effects of 5G is effectively nothing. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I'll describe what 5G is and then talk about health effects that we know occur from 3G and 4G, the third and fourth generation of radiofrequency radiation. Now, I should also say this is not my personal research. When I first came to Albany in 1980 as the director of the Health Department Laboratories, 2 weeks before I arrived, there'd been a settlement of a controversy about whether there were health effects of high voltage power lines. And as a new guy on the block, I was put in charge of administering that program, which concluded that yes, there was an elevation in risk of leukemia in children exposed to excessive magnetic fields from electricity. Well, once you touch this subject, you never escape from it. So when our program ended in 1987, I became the spokesperson for New York State on the issue of health effects of electromagnetic fields. And while I don't work for the health department any longer, that still applies basically. Now, let me say that this is a controversial subject. I very much welcome questions as we go along that you probably forget them if you wait till after the talk is over. So don't hesitate to interrupt me. All right, so what is 5G? Well, it's the 5th generation of electromagnetic communication frequencies. We currently have 2G, 3G, and 4G. These are the development of cell phone frequencies. And while we don't know hardly anything about the health effects of 5G because they simply haven't been studied yet, we do know a lot about the health effects of 3G and 4G. Now this is the electromagnetic spectrum. It goes everything on the low end from the frequencies that are associated with electricity, where you have both electric and magnetic fields. And then the radio frequency part is what we use for radio, for television, for cell phones, for Wi-Fi, for GPS. And obviously we're all bathed in those frequencies all the time. And so a lot of what I will talk about today is the health effects of excessive exposure there. Now, 5G extends the electromagnetic spectrum up into this range. It's in the gigahertz range. So electromagnetic fields are pulses of energy with no mass. What we know best is visible light. And visible light, the reason you can distinguish red from blue is the frequency of the sine wave. Now, that's much higher frequency than our communication frequencies. But they've been in the megahertz range, and now the 5G is going up to much higher frequencies, which will allow more information to be transmitted. But again, it's being implemented without any concern or any health effects studies, and that's really what the big concern is. Now, I didn't mention, but at the far end of that electromagnetic spectrum, we have ionizing radiation. These are electromagnetic fields with sufficient energy to break chemical bonds, to damage DNA. We know them as X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays. They're different from the particulate ionizing radiation, alpha particles, beta particles, and so forth. These are just sine waves, but of sufficient energy that they can directly damage DNA. They cause cancer, they cause birth defects, and a whole variety of things. So the real question is, what about these lower energy electromagnetic fields? Are they also dangerous to health? And I'll talk about that in fair detail. So the radio frequency part, these are the communication frequencies. And obviously, if you can turn your radio on and change the dial on either AM or FM station, what you're doing is selectively receiving different frequencies. But if you can do that in this room or outside or anywhere, that means we're constantly being exposed to those frequencies. In other words, all of us are continuously exposed to radio frequency radiation. If you can use your cell phone, that's because the cell tower is generating radio frequency radiation. And when you pick up your cell tower, it increases the signal. Your cell phone generates signals that go back to the cell tower. So now we know a fair bit about health effects there. It used to be that radio and television dominated our environment with radio frequency radiation. But that has really changed in a dramatic way in the last few years, mainly from cell phones, from Wi-Fi. We now have smart meters. We have a whole series of wireless devices. And the question is, what is the danger? So this just lists everything. Now, a cordless telephone, if you can pick it up and walk across the room, it's communicating to the base with radio frequency radiation. Wi-Fi is radio frequency radiation. Satellite communication is all radio frequency radiation. So you have a satellite up there generating radio frequency radiation, and we're all continuously exposed to that. Now, the self-driving automobiles, that's all going to be 5G. And that's going to be signals going out continuously in all directions to see where the curb is, to see where the next car is, to see where the stop sign is. So it's going to dramatically increase the exposure. This is just a plot of the change in radio frequency exposure over time. And notice, this is not that long ago. 2006, 2005, then things started really taking off. Below that, there was always some exposure, but it wasn't that great. Now, I was a co-editor-in-chief of an encyclopedic review of health effects called the Bioinitiative Report. If anybody's interested in checking that out, it's at www.bioinitiative.org. It's more information than you'd ever want to know. But in that report, we set a level that we thought would be protective of human health, and that's what the green line is. And you can see that we are way, way over that now, and by orders of magnitude. All right, so these are basically microwaves. It's the same microwave that drives your microwave oven. Now, you can cook your potato in the microwave oven. Hopefully, when you hold your cell phone to your head, you're not cooking your brain. And in fact, the standards that we have in this country and in many countries of the world for the intensity of radio frequency radiation from cell phones is based on the fallacious assumption that there are no adverse health effects other than tissue heating. And I'll show you that is the case. Now, as I said, these are all sine waves, but of different frequencies. They all travel at the speed of light. That's why you can get on your cell phone and call someone in California and you don't notice any delay, because they travel very rapidly. Now, let's move on then and talk about, are there adverse health effects of 3G and 4G? Or in this case, even the lower frequencies from radio and television towers. Vatican Radio is an extremely powerful AM radio station that transmits all over Europe. And Michelozzi and his colleagues looked at the rates of childhood leukemia as people lived further and further away from the transmission tower. And they found elevations in childhood leukemia in children living close to the tower. There have been a number of studies done in Korea, also demonstrating elevations in childhood leukemia in people that live close to high-powered AM and FM radio transmission towers. Now, it's interesting, as I mentioned, when I got involved in this, when I was administering this program on power line magnetic fields, the finding that we found in those studies was an elevation in childhood leukemia. So I would conclude from this that if your whole body is exposed to high intensity radio frequency radiation, there's an elevated risk of leukemia. Now, cell phones. There are almost as many cell phones as there are people in the world now. That data is over 10 years old. And there's a large body of evidence that if you use cell phones a lot every day for 10 years or more, you are at elevated risk of brain cancer. I'll show you some of that data. Don't believe the reports to the contrary, which usually come from people that have conflicts of interest, from the communications companies or people that receive funding from them. In my judgment, the evidence is very strong that there's an elevated risk of brain cancer in people that use cell phones intensely for a long period of time. Now, the problem is, I showed you that plot of our increased exposure, but we know from ionizing radiation, which also increases risk of brain cancer, that the latency between exposure and development of the brain cancer is often 20 or 30 years. So the issue, again, from a public health perspective, is we're having this enormous increase in exposure, and is that going to result in a dramatic increase in brain cancer in the future? All right, so quickly to summarize the diseases that I want to talk about, I'm going to focus a lot on cancer because everybody understands that. There clear evidence for glioma, glioblastoma, certain kinds of brain cancer, not very much for meningioma, another kind of brain cancer. There's also evidence for a tumor of the auditory nerve, for a cancer of the salivary glands in the cheek, a little bit of evidence for thyroid gland, although that's not as strong. And there's some evidence now that women that wear their cell phone turned on in their bra are at elevated risk for breast cancer. I was horrified to see my daughter, who's a horse veterinarian, put her cell phone in her bra. She says, well, I need to be in communication. I need to work with both hands. I gave her papers that show elevated breast cancer if you have a cell phone worn in your bra a lot. Now, I'm not going to talk much about it today, but there's clear evidence that these radiofrequency radiations reduce sperm count and damage sperm. And I like to say that a man that holds a wireless laptop on his lap for many hours a day probably doesn't need to wear a condom for the next week. It's that serious. We are seeing decreased fertility, especially male fertility, but also female fertility. And this may be contributing. It's certainly not the only factor. I'll talk a little bit about some of the effects on cognitive function. Again, that's not nearly as strong evidence as it is for cancer, but it's a concern. A particular concern is a wireless computer classroom, which most elementary, middle, and high schools now think you have to have because it's modern technology. Those kids are sitting in a mini microwave oven because you have one router and you have 20 or 30 kids with a wireless device communicating to the router. The reality is if you had a wired classroom, there would be no elevated exposure. Wi-Fi is not necessarily a good thing when you can have wired connections to the internet, which every child should have. And then there's this new syndrome of electrohypersensitivity, which is even more controversial. This is a situation where people get headaches, they feel fatigue, they feel ringing in their ears if they're in an environment with high levels of radio frequency fields. Not everybody is affected, and I will say I was very skeptical of this in the past, but I'm becoming convinced it's a real syndrome in certain people. And I'll talk a little more about that. Okay, so studies on cancer. This is brain cancer in people that use cell phones a lot. Now, I will use this nomenclature. OR stands for odds ratio. And in epidemiology, that's what we use. So if you have an odds ratio, take the number in the bottom of 1.57, that means an increased risk of brain cancer that's almost double that of, it's 1.5 times what you would expect. And then the numbers in parenthesis are the 95% confidence limit. So in epidemiology, you never can be 100% sure, but if that lower bound is greater than 1.0, that means we would accept that as a statistically significant finding. Meta-analyses are done when people collect all of the data on a particular subject and evaluate the strengths or the weaknesses of individual projects and then calculate an odds ratio. And you see all of the meta-analyses on brain cancer and exposure to excessive use of cell phones show a statistically significant increase. Now, that's bad enough, but, this study, the Interphone study, was done in many different countries and also found high evidence. What I wanted to say is there's real concern that younger people are at greater risk than older people. So for all ages, there's a statistically significant increase in risk of brain cancer, but if you're under 20 years of age, it's 5-fold greater. And again, in our society, it's every teenager that's on their cell phone. And that really poses concern about what happens in the future, given the latency for development of brain cancer. All right, so how do we know that these radio frequency fields are penetrating the brain? Well, you can't take measurements in a living brain, but this is a model of brains of different people of different ages. And you see in the adult in the upper left, there is penetration of these signals into the brain, but it's sort of right by the ear. But in a younger child, almost the whole brain is exposed. And that probably is the explanation for why children are more vulnerable than adults. Also, their brains are developing and growing. The skull is thinner, a variety of things. Now, this is an interesting study. This was actually published by the director of one of the institutes of NIH. And the study was, the brain uses glucose as its energy source. And there's a form of glucose called deoxyglucose that can't be metabolized by the brain, but it can be labeled and can accumulate, and so you can visualize it. And so the plot on the right is a brain of a person just looking at its normal background metabolic activity. They're holding a cell phone to their ear, but the cell phone is turned off. On the left, the cell phone was turned on, but sound was muted. So this was not when you're talking, when there's more signal. But what you see is there is an increase. The red is a reflection of an increased metabolism of the brain just from having the cell phone on, but not in use. So there's no question but what cell phone frequencies penetrate your brain and change the metabolism of your brain. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to cancer, but people that say it doesn't affect your brain, it's just absolutely not true. Now, this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity, one of the major complaints is headache, ringing in the ears, fatigue, weakness, memory impairment, brain fog. All of those are central nervous system symptoms. And many of these people that show these symptoms can't use a cell phone, can't have Wi-Fi in their house. I've walked with people that are electrosensitive down a sidewalk and they can point to a cell tower because they can perceive it. I can't. I'm not electrosensitive. But the cause of this disorder is unknown, but as all of us are more and more exposed, this probably is going to become more common. It's interesting, in the height of the Cold War, the Soviets irradiated the US Embassy in Moscow with microwaves. The Soviet Union had much stricter standards for radio frequency exposure than Western countries did. And we all became very paranoid at that time because we thought they knew something we didn't. There were studies on the health of employees there. They didn't find any elevation in cancer, which is not surprising since that takes a long latency. But a lot of employees had headaches, they couldn't sleep at night, they were anxious, they felt like their brain wasn't working. It was all passed off as being anxiety. Some of it may have been, but it also may have been this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity. Other studies have shown that not everybody that blames electromagnetic fields for their headaches actually can respond to those exposures, but some people can. So I was asked to go back and look at old data on this, and there's some very good evidence, mainly from Defense Department people that were exposed suddenly and unintentionally to radar. Radar is a high-frequency electromagnetic field. A number of these reports showed these people, healthy young males in the military, exposed to radar unintentionally, and they developed this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity that lasted for many years. I had occasion to meet this guy, a young guy who was a technician for Verizon in California. He went in to repair some Verizon radio frequency generating equipment. It was all supposed to be turned off. Not all of it was. He was in there about an hour, developed a strong headache. He came to my office 2 years later as a chronically ill individual, photophobia, constant headaches, couldn't work any longer, had that whole syndrome of electrohypersensitivity. So not everybody has an acute event that triggers this, but clearly some people do. As I said, the sources of exposure to radio frequency radiation, they're much more than just cell phones. Probably what is really important is our aggregate exposure. We're all getting exposure from AM and FM and television and satellites and that sort of thing. But if we use our cell phone a lot, if we are in an environment that has excessive exposure, that's going to contribute to our full body harm. Now, the World Health Organization about 15 years ago declared radio frequency fields to be a probable human carcinogen. And that was based mainly on these human studies, but they weren't very strong because at that time there wasn't any good evidence that animals developed brain cancer from cell phone frequencies. And there wasn't a good sense of what the mechanism was. That's really changed. A year ago, the National Toxicology Program of the National Institutes of Health reported the results of a lifelong exposure of rats and mice to cell phone frequency radiation. So obviously, they weren't holding a cell phone to their head, their whole body was being exposed. What they found is elevated glial tumors in the brain and an elevation in a Schwann cell tumor, it was of the heart in the animals, but it was like the tumor in the auditory nerve we see in people. And then about at the same time, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy reported results of a different study where they used much lower intensities of exposure, modeled after that you would get if you lived near to a cell tower. and they found the same 2 cancers. So animals do get the same cancers people do. Now, what are the mechanisms? Again, we know a lot about mechanisms. There are a whole series of things that happen with these exposures. The major one that seems to be quite consistent and is probably the initiating event is generation of reactive oxygen species, otherwise known as free radicals. And that's been demonstrated in people, in animals, in isolated cells. And then it triggers a whole variety of things like changes in the blood-brain barrier, changes in cerebral blood flow. I've shown you the changes in brain metabolism. These frequencies don't directly damage DNA, but the generation of these free radicals does damage DNA. So it's not correct to say we don't know a mechanism. So how strong is the evidence? Well, I see it as being very strong. Not everybody agrees with me. Now, in every situation like this, of course, you have to balance risk versus benefit. We all love our devices. I mean, it's amazing how communication has changed in the last 20 years. But there are really reasons to at least understand some of the hazards and find ways to do what you can to reduce your exposure without changing your quality of life. So how serious is the problem? I can't really say. I think it's serious. I think we're going to see increase in a whole variety of diseases as we increase our exposure, particularly those that are long in latency. Now, there is a real problem because exposure comes from so many places. It's hard to get a good measure of total exposure. And when exposure assessment is difficult and inadequate, usually you're underestimating what the risk is. So, how much of brain cancer is due to exposure? How much of leukemia is due to exposure? How much of learning disabilities in schools is due to exposure to radiofrequency radiation? I can't really answer those questions, but I can certainly tell you that in my judgment, these are contributing factors. So what about other sources? Well, I don't know if you even know what smart meters are. Let me tell you a little about smart meters. It used to be that on every house or every apartment you had a meter that reported your electricity use, and someone had to come around. Either you had to read the meter or someone came around to read the meter every month or so, and that was the basis of the bill you got from the electric company. Now everyone is putting smart meters on their house. Smart meters don't have to be read because they generate radio frequency signals that go to the utility. So the utility can determine how much electricity you use without anybody coming to read it. Now in the future, and this gets to the quotes Internet of Things, already every appliance that you buy, dishwashers, dryers, refrigerators, all of them have embedded in them a little device called a Zigbee drive. Most of them are not activated yet, but they're going to communicate to your smart meter how much electricity your dishwasher uses. And the utility is going to actually be able to control that and even turn off some of your devices in times of high electricity use. But this is going to make your kitchen, your laundry room, a little microwave oven because all of these devices are going to be talking to your smart meter. Is that a good thing? Big question. So it's this kind of thing that there's a central collecting point, and that information goes to the utility, but every house will be communicating constantly with the utility. And the signals there are unusual. They're very brief but very intense pulses. And there are now a number of situations where people suddenly became ill after a smart meter was put on their house. Nobody quite understands what component of these signals is more provocative, but many people think, without absolute proof, that it's the rapid rise and off that's particularly dangerous. But they're not good studies of the health of people that have smart meters on their house before and after. It's almost impossible to do that study. But we do know that people complain about developing electro-hypersensitivity after smart meters are put on. So are they dangerous? Well, nobody has ever studied only those. So basically our information comes primarily from the cell phone use. How certain are we that they cause disease? It's debatable. But I don't think the cell phone use in brain cancer is debatable. I think the issues of electro-hypersensitivity are much more debatable, how much it's anxiety, how definitive the evidence is that radiofrequency exposure causes that. One can argue on both sides. I'm pretty convinced that it's real because I've just seen too many people with those symptoms. All right, so what can we do? We're not going to go back to a pre-wireless age. But, you know, if you use a landline, there's no radiofrequency exposure at all. And, you know, landlines are viewed as being old-fashioned. If you send text messages, that's not so bad, because nobody's demonstrated cancer of the thumbs. Now, if you look at the fine print in the manual for your cell phone, it'll say, don't hold this cell phone closer to your ear than about 1 inch. Nobody reads that, nobody pays attention. That may just be that the cell phone companies, when you develop your brain cancer, want to say, well, we told you not to hold it right next to your head. The exposure decreases dramatically with distance. If you're texting out here, your hands will be exposed, but your body hardly at all. If you take your cell phone even a little away from your head, you dramatically reduce the exposure to your brain. If you use a wired earpiece and have your cell phone on the desk, you have effectively no exposure. Now, if you wear a Bluetooth and wear your cell phone in your belt or in your pocket, you reduce the exposure to your brain, but the exposure is to your pelvis. Nobody has really studied prostate cancer, GI cancers, cancers of the abdomen. I would predict that we're going to find that. So, you know, especially for kids, children should not play with cell phones, especially very young children. And I actually was on a panel in New York City just a week ago on addiction to smartphones. It's a real problem, not just with children, but it's a growing problem in people that are vulnerable to addiction. You know, can't be away from it. They sleep with it under their pillow. And it's on, so not only does it interrupt their sleep because they're anxious to get every message that comes in, but they're constantly being exposed. Those are things that we can do or not do that aren't terribly difficult, that really will reduce exposures. Other things, don't place transmission towers, cell phone towers near schools, near vulnerable people. Don't put wireless networks in schools. Have wired computer labs. Resist the general movement to make everything wireless because there's a risk there. All right, now let me move on to 5G because that's what I was supposed to be talking about. So it's the Internet of Things. It's going to be smart cities, although some of us think it's not so smart. Self-driving vehicles, trucks and buses and cars. Wearable wireless devices, even wireless implants in people. Currently, the frequencies of 3G and 4G are in the megahertz range. This is now in the gigahertz range. It does have real potential for increasing information transfer. It'll be 100 times faster than 4G. It will add new jobs. This whole business of the Trump administration and Huawei, the Chinese firm, is debates on who can develop the technology the fastest. I was in China in June, and I couldn't read most of the things, but I could see 5G on billboards along the highways all over the place. So the whole world seems to be rushing to implement this new technology with zero thought about the adverse health effects. So the limitations of 5G, and some of this may, from a health perspective, not be so bad, may even be better than the 4G. These signals don't travel as far as 4G. I think I first got asked to talk to an Albany audience about this when one of our vice presidents had a mini cell tower being installed right in front of his house. For 5G, they're going to have a mini cell tower in front of about every sixth house on every street in America, because the signals don't go that far. This means that you're going to not be able to walk down a sidewalk without being continuously exposed at very high intensities. Now, the signals are blocked by trees, by buildings, so that may be a good thing. So these mini cell towers in the street may not penetrate the house very far. And it also may be that these signals don't penetrate our bodies as much as the current radio frequency signals do. The scanners in the airport are 5G. Now, you don't spend a lot of time in that scanner, but they are reported to only see your skin. They don't see internal organs. Well, that's a good thing, but imagine standing in the scanner at the airport continuously or for long periods of time. We suspect that there won't be the brain cancer from 5G, but there may be skin cancers. There may be other effects on the skin. However, nobody has actually looked at that at all. So there's almost no research on 5G. We know that 4G poses dangers. We know that there are dangers on reproduction, dangers in cancer, some evidence for effects on the brain in terms of cognitive function. But how 5G will influence those is really not clear. But we should be able to take advantage of technology without suffering adverse health effects, and that's really the question. What is the real benefit of 5G to most people? Well, it's that you can download a movie much faster than you can at present. Is that really an advantage? Now, in the US, the government body that regulates this kind of communication is the Federal Communications Commission. I visited the FCC with a colleague a couple of years ago, trying to argue for a better understanding of the adverse health effects of our current technology. Almost every one of the commissioners comes directly from the telecommunications industry. The chairman certainly does. They have absolutely no health expertise whatsoever, and they don't pretend to. They say, well, we get our health expertise from other agencies of the federal government, but those other agencies have no programs to evaluate these things. The FCC standard is that there's no adverse health effect except that mediated by tissue heating. And that is so blatantly false. There are thousands of studies that show health effects in people, show biological effects in animals, in cells, isolated cells, and so forth. And the people running the FCC just ignore this information. The Bioinitiative report that I mentioned earlier contains a lot of that information. Now, to make matters even worse, in 1996, the Federal Communications Act was passed by Congress, and the utilities snuck in there a provision that you could not object to the placement of a cell tower based on health effects. You could object because it was ugly, because it reduced your property value, but you couldn't object because it causes cancer. And in spite of efforts, that proviso has not been removed from that act. And the utilities are using that up to this point for the 5G rollout, saying that the city of Albany cannot object to placement of these mini cell towers in front of every sixth house, because this act says that we can do that and health is not a concern. They're not ugly, they're relatively little things, and they're mounted on the telephone poles, the light poles, that sort of thing. So we've got a real problem in that our government is not protecting us. So how do you look at this? Well, I think one has to look at the weight of evidence. Now, I'm certainly not saying that this is the greatest threat to our health and safety that we have. There are a whole variety of things that are dangerous, much more dangerous than electromagnetic fields. But that there is a danger here is, from my perspective, overwhelming. And the fact is that it's so easy to do things that will reduce the risk. It's stupid not to. So, the reality is you get a high exposure from holding a cell phone to your head. But if it's aggregate total exposure that we get, then just doing these reasonable things is a way to go. It makes good sense. So just in conclusion, the fact that you can download a movie faster with 5G, or that you can have a car that is driverless and you just plug in and then go to sleep while you go to work, that really doesn't answer the question, is what are the risks of that technology? We all benefit from technology, and that's fine, but we should not be rolling out a new technology without at least some attention to the question of whether there are adverse health effects. That's the essence of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle was enunciated in a United Nations meeting in Rio de Janeiro a number of years ago. And it basically says when you have some evidence for harm, but you haven't dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, you should pay attention and do what you can without enormous disruption of your lifestyle to reduce exposure. And I think this is the point that all of us should have. I often get asked, do you have Wi-Fi in your house? Yes, I do. Do you have a cell phone? Yes, I do. I don't use it that often. I only use it when I need to, when I'm traveling. I use landlines at home and in my office. But you don't have to throw up your hands and not use modern technology or freak out about this to take reasonable precautionary steps to reduce your exposure. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have them. Yes?
Quick question. I thought I heard something about these radio waves were affecting the bees. Did you hear anything about that in regards to,
Yes, there's some evidence that, again, I think nobody really knows what's affecting the bees. My personal suspicion is it's the excessive use of pesticides, much more important than these radio waves. But there are a number of publications that have actually done studies where they placed hives near cell phone towers and that sort of thing, and found that the bees didn't survive well. Now, that doesn't mean that they'd controlled for pesticides. It was interesting. I had a high school student who did a high school research project with me last year. She looked at wheat seeds and their growth compared to having a cell phone turned on in the exposed group and a cell phone but turned off in the unexposed group. And she showed dramatic differences in the rates of growth. Now, it was a high school project. I must say I was just blown away by her results because I'm not aware of anyone that's really published data on that. But it's not surprising that if these fields are generating reactive oxygen species, it's not surprising they would influence wildlife, they would influence plant growth. A lot more needs to be done on that kind of thing, however. Yes?
Are there any countries that are sort of taking the lead on this, that are sort of more aware of the issues?
Yes, there certainly are. France is the country that's probably most energetic. They've banned cell phones in elementary schools. They have strong advisories. It's interesting that in this country, I testified to the Maine legislature on several occasions asking that a warning be put on cell phones like we have on cigarette packs. It didn't go anywhere there. However, effectively the same legislation was passed in Berkeley, California, and has withstood objections from the telecommunications agency there. There are a number of countries that have much more rigorous standards than we have in the US. Ours are probably the loosest, again, based only on this prevention of tissue heating. There's activity around 5G all over the world. I'm actually scheduled to go to Australia to talk about this in a few months. I went with colleagues to the World Health Organization in Geneva 2 years ago to argue that they change their position on this subject. They actually are presently soliciting a whole series of reviews on health effects of radiofrequency radiation. I hope that they come out with a much stronger position than they have had, given the level of the information we have. The animal studies showing the same cancers in animals we get in people cannot be ignored. And the evidence in human studies is also very strong. But in the US, we have almost no research on any aspect of this, even the 3G and 4G. Federal agencies are not supporting research. What little research is supported by the utilities, and it's of course not surprising, they find absolutely no hazard. There was another question over there. Yes?
I was going to ask about trying to define excessive use, like during the day.
I'm sorry?
The idea of defining excessive use of a cell phone during the day, it may be hard, but trying to quantify it, like putting a number on it. How many hours would you consider excessive use?
Well, in this Interphone study, the study in multiple countries, they had a statistically significantly increased risk of cancer in people that had an aggregate use of 1,640 hours. Now that's over a period of time. So, and I've had people in my office suffering from brain cancer. I had a Cuban lawyer, a Cuban ethnicity, who was dying of brain cancer. And his story was he'd used the cell phone all the time. The really bad cancer is glioblastoma. That's what Ted Kennedy died of, what John McCain died of, what Beau Biden died of, what Johnny Cochran died of. Now, we don't know how much cell phone use any of those people had, but given their positions, I would bet it was excessive. I'm not saying they all died of cell phone use, but they have the cancer, and it was located in the part of the brain that's near to the ear. The other thing I didn't mention on these studies of brain cancer, the cancers only occur in a statistically significant fashion on the side of the head that the person traditionally uses their cell phone. And that's pretty strong evidence for cause and effect. Yes?
I was wondering if there's any studies that look at the RF exposure in certain occupations, like emergency services or broadcast.
Well, there certainly are a number of those that have done that. They've actually been more on the electricity level. Telephone linemen, power linemen have elevations in leukemia risks. For the radio frequency exposure, I guess I'm not really aware of many studies. There have been a number, actually there are some. Ham radio operators have elevations in both brain cancer and leukemia than non-ham radio operators, and that's been known for quite a while. But the reality is we all have so many sources of exposure, and how do you quantitate aggregate total exposure? It's very, very difficult. You can't wear a big meter that measures these things for years and years, and then see what diseases you develop.
And how is it, you mentioned meters, how is it detected? Like if someone wanted to measure how much...
Well, there are meters that you can use to measure these fields. They're not even that expensive, $600, $700. But the problem is that I bet if you just walked around this room, you'd find quite a bit of variation from one place to the other. If you go into any office, you're going to, or any kitchen or any laundry room, you're going to find great variation. But the biggest source for most people is use of their cell phone. And that's again because it's held close to their body. But it's by far not the only use.
One more question and then we'll wrap up.
Yes?
So it's seems like sort of a simple question. So when I talk on my phone, almost always with my right ear, there's one side that's to my face. I know now, I'll hold it out here. And there's another side that is not to my face. Has anybody done any work where there's something shielding that's where I'm speaking, as opposed to looking at,
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is yes, and there are so many scams on the market. It's incredible. Some guy came to my office offering me a pendant that would block all radio frequency radiation. Another person came with a little bag you could put over your cell phone that would stop exposure. And it actually works, but you can't use it if it can't communicate with the cell tower.
Right.
So
I was thinking like sort of one side to the other.
yeah, I don't know the answer to that specific question, but that's an area of research. It's not going to be easy to prevent exposure to your head if you prevent exposure to your cell phone. That's why a wired earpiece is such a much better thing.
You're saying like a Bluetooth or speakers?
Well, I don't recommend Bluetooth because you have to have your cell phone somewhere. If you have it on your desk and you have a Bluetooth, that's not so bad. Better thing is have your cell phone on your desk and a wired earpiece to your ear. You'll
Put it
have
on speaker,
effectively, or a speaker.
Right.
You'll have effectively no exposure
Well,
there.
that's good to know because I'm a multitasker. That's usually what I do.
Well, I told you it was a controversial topic.
Yeah.
And I think I've convinced you that that's true.
Thank you so much, Professor.
My pleasure.